The hidden ancestry of African Americans. The untold story. Have you ever questioned the true ancestry of African Americans? Most believe their roots are mainly in Africa, with some connections to Native American tribes and Europe. Genetic studies seem to back this up, showing African Americans as having about 73.2% African DNA, 24% European DNA, and only 0.8% Native American DNA. This narrative has led many to believe they are predominantly descendants of African slaves. But what if this isn't the whole story? New research suggests that 98% of African Americans have Native American roots. Why has this been hidden, and what is being concealed? To uncover this truth, we need to explore a largely forgotten chapter in history. Before Columbus arrived in 1492, millions of native Black Americans, or Indians, lived on the land. After Columbus, many of these indigenous people seemingly vanished. In reality, many were shipped to Europe and Africa as Indian slaves. The story of the slave trade we've been taught might be backward. Instead of a massive influx of Africans to America, Black Indians were taken from America to Europe and then to Africa, later being brought back to America and mislabeled as African slaves. This crucial part of history is often excluded from school curriculums. European colonizers exploited Indian slaves for construction, plantations, and mining. Records from South Carolina indicate that between 1650 and 1730, at least 50,000 Indians were exported to Caribbean outposts, with many sent to places like Barbados and Martinique. In the Northeast, Indians were displaced by the fur trade and forced south, where they were used to hunt slaves living in Spanish mission communities. This exploitation by European powers created a complex network of alliances and conflicts, aiming to depopulate land for European settlers. As the Indian slave trade declined, it was replaced by the African slave trade in the late 1700s. Native American women intermarried with imported Africans, resulting in mixed-race offspring whose native identities were gradually erased. Colonial records often reclassified these individuals as colored, obscuring their Native American heritage. Today, many African Americans with Native American ancestry remain unrecognized. Public records changes reclassified individuals initially documented as Indians to colored, leading to an unacknowledged population with Native American roots, especially in the Northeast. In 2015, Native American tribes were awarded nearly $1 billion in a historic settlement against the U.S. Department of Justice. The government feared more Native Indians, often labeled as colored or black, would uncover their true history and seek reparations. The U.S. imposed a deadline for claims, but the fight for recognition continues. Who are these Native Black Americans? Dr. David Imhotep, a historian with a PhD in ancient African ancestry, suggests that Africans were present in ancient America long before Columbus. In his book, They Came Before Columbus, historian Ivan van Sertima presents evidence of an African presence in the New World, pointing to navigation and shipbuilding techniques that could have enabled transatlantic voyages and drawing cultural parallels between Native Americans and Africans. Historical accounts support this African influence, including a fleet launched by the Malian Empire in 1310 and a sea expedition led by the Mandingo King in 1311. Dr. Imhotep's book, The First Americans Were Africans, calls for a reevaluation of history, emphasizing genetic and geological evidence showing Africans were present in the Americas long before the Vikings or Columbus. The identity of Black people in America is diverse, encompassing Afro-Indigenous, Black Native, and Indigenous. By honoring both heritages, they challenge the tradition of categorizing people into distinct racial groups. Despite their struggles, Black and Native peoples have resisted oppression, building enduring movements of resistance. What do you think? Are African Americans descendants of African slaves, or do they have a deeper connection to Native American heritage? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you've had your DNA tested, let us know the percentage of native Black Indian DNA you have. And if you're interested in uncovering more hidden histories, support us by subscribing to Noble Black News and clicking the like button. Black Indians are Native American people who have significant African American heritage. These individuals are culturally and communally Native American, while also possessing African ancestry. The relationship between Native Americans and African Americans has deep historical roots, particularly in areas where slavery was widespread or where free people of color lived. Some members of the Five Civilized Tribes, Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw, even held enslaved African Americans. When these tribes were forced to move west on the Trail of Tears during the Indian removal in the 1830s, they brought enslaved people with them. In a controversial move during the late 20th century, some tribes like the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole tightened membership rules, excluding freedmen descendants of freed African American slaves, unless they had an ancestor listed as Native American on the early 20th century Dawes rolls. This exclusion was challenged in courts, arguing that it contradicted treaty conditions and pointed out possible inaccuracies in the rolls. The Chickasaw Nation, on the other hand, never extended citizenship to the Chickasaw freedmen. Historically, the interactions between Native Americans and African Americans were neglected in mainstream history. While Africans had varying degrees of contact with Native Americans, they did not live together as extensively as they did with Europeans. However, in regions like New England and the southern United States, where Africans were enslaved in large numbers, cultural exchange and intermarriage with Native Americans were more common. Today, many African Americans have some Native American ancestry, although most haven't grown up in those cultures or maintained cultural or linguistic ties. Relations between Native Americans, Africans, and African Americans were complex. Some tribes welcomed Africans into their communities, while others saw them primarily as slaves. During the Seminole Wars in Florida, for instance, Native Americans and people of African descent fought alongside each other against U.S. expansion. Conversely, after the American Civil War, some African Americans joined the U.S. Army and fought against Native Americans in the western frontier, where their military units became known as the Buffalo Soldiers, a nickname given to them by Native Americans. The history of Black Indians dates back to early European colonization. Records show that in April 1502, the first enslaved African arrived in Hispaniola, and some escaped inland to join native tribes. These individuals became the first group of Black Indians. In 1526, an enslaved African in a Spanish colony near present-day South Carolina fled and sought refuge with local Native Americans. By the early 17th century, Africans and Native Americans were interacting regularly, including in the Algonquian tribe, which integrated African captives into their communities. In New England and the southern colonies, enslaved Africans often found themselves in Native American communities through marriage or escape. Colonial newspapers from that era mention African slaves who ran off with his Indian wife or had kin among the Indians. However, European colonists sought to drive a wedge between these groups. South Carolina, for instance, passed laws in the 18th century to prevent interactions between Africans and Native Americans, fearing potential alliances between them. Despite attempts to separate them, African Americans and Native Americans often found common cause against European settlers. During Pontiac's War in 1753, for example, Native tribes were noted to spare Africans while attacking European settlers, which raised fears among colonists of a possible uprising. Some tribes, like the Cherokee, even passed laws to create an aversion to African Americans to thwart potential alliances. European colonists also enslaved Native Americans. In the southern colonies, natives were sold into slavery and sent to places like the Caribbean, Hispaniola, and the northern colonies. By the 18th century, the Indian slave trade declined as African slaves became more prevalent. However, the enslavement of Native Americans persisted, with records showing Native children kept as slaves in places like Long Island, New York, as late as the 18th century. The blending of African and Native American cultures was common, with intermarriage producing mixed-race children. In Cherokee society, for instance, as the number of slaves held by the tribe increased, so did intermarriage between African and Native American people. However, European influence and the adoption of European culture led to increased discrimination against those of African Cherokee descent. During the 19th century and into the Civil War, Black Indians played significant roles. The Seminole people of Florida, for example, included Africans who had escaped slavery and intermarried with the tribe, creating the group known as the Black Seminole. African Americans and Black Indians also fought in the American Civil War, with some joining Union forces in Indian Territory. After the Civil War, the U.S. government required new peace treaties with the Five Civilized Tribes, mandating the emancipation of slaves and the incorporation of freedmen as full citizens in their nations. Despite these changes, the legacy of Black Indians remains a complex and often overlooked part of American history, reflecting centuries of cultural exchange, conflict, and resilience.
Or perceived authenticity. Many blend their Black and Native identities by using traditional language or developing new expressions that reflect their unique heritage. Since the first contact between Africans and Native peoples, Black and Indigenous ancestors have built communities, formed relationships, and fought against systems of oppression unique to their communities as well as those that overlap. Despite the hardships faced, Black and Native peoples have never been conquered. They have found ways to resist oppression, creating modes of defiance such as abolition, free towns, cross-cultural alliances, kinship ties, and community building.
Welcome to Noble Black News, where empowerment meets truth. Our mission is to uplift and empower the Black community. We stand for truth, integrity, and representation. Our stories are your stories, told with pride and passion. Join us as we celebrate our heritage and our future. Together, we are stronger, louder, and more united. Noble Black News is your voice, your platform, your news. We bring you the stories that matter, with integrity and heart. Our commitment is to the truth, no matter the cost. We highlight the achievements and struggles of our community. Every story we tell is a step towards empowerment. We are more than news. We are a movement. Join us in making a difference, one story at a time. Together, we can change the narrative. Noble Black News, empowering our community, one story at a time.